Top 6 actors Lee Van Cleef hated the most. Lee Van Cleef was born with the name Clarence Leroy Van Cleef Jr. on January 9, 1925, in a town called Somerville, New Jersey. His parents were regular working people who came from Holland a long time ago. When he was young, nobody could guess he would become a famous movie star one day. After he finished high school, he joined the Navy and fought bravely in World War II. He worked on a special ship that cleared underwater bombs in the Pacific Ocean. Being in the military taught him to be tough and serious, which helped him a lot when he became an actor later. After the war ended, Van Cleef came back home and got regular jobs like being an accountant and a house painter. But then something amazing happened. He got picked to be in a play in his town, and people noticed how intense and powerful he looked. On stage, movie scouts from Hollywood saw him and thought he could be in movies. His first movie was in 1952 called High Noon, where he played a bad guy gunslinger who didn't even have any words to say. Even though it was a tiny part, people remembered him because he looked so different and scary. He had sharp cheekbones, a nose like a hawk, and eyes that seemed to stare right through you. Van Cleef didn't look like the handsome movie stars everyone was used to seeing, but being different turned out to be the best thing about him. All through the 1950s and early 1960s, he got jobs playing bad guys in tons of cowboy movies and crime shows. His characters were usually henchmen, outlaws, or cold-blooded killers. And even though he wasn't the main star during this time, people always remembered his performances. Movies like Kansas City, Confidential in 1952, The Big Combo in 1955, and The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance in 1962 showed how good he was at commanding attention on screen even when he barely had any lines to say. Sadly, in 1958, he got in a terrible car crash that hurt his knee really bad. For a while, everyone thought his acting career might be finished. But then the 1960s brought an amazing comeback to Van Cleef's career that made him a movie legend. An Italian movie director named Sergio Leone picked him to be in a famous spaghetti western called For a Few Dollars More in 1965, where he acted alongside Clint Eastwood. Van Cleef played Colonel Douglas Mortimer, a tough and dignified bounty hunter who wanted revenge. His acting in that movie amazed everyone who watched it, showing a charm and depth that nobody had really seen in his earlier roles. This was the start of him becoming a leading man, which was really rare for actors who had been playing villains for so long. He worked with Eastwood again in The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly in 1966, where he played Angel Eyes, the heartless and calculating bad guy in Leone's famous trio of characters. The movie was a huge hit and made Van Cleef famous all over the world. Unlike many actors who might have disappeared when cowboy movies became less popular, Van Cleef totally embraced the spaghetti western style and starred in a bunch of European westerns throughout the 1960s and 1970s. These movies included in 1969, Death Rides a Horse in 1967, The Big Gun Down in 1966, and Day of Anger in 1967. Each role made people respect him even more as a master of quiet intensity in characters who weren't clearly good or bad. His movie personality was all about quiet authority. He spoke softly but always seemed dangerous. Unlike other Western stars who relied on being loud heroes, Van Cleef's characters were often thoughtful, calculating, and driven by their own personal rules about what was right and wrong, even if they walked down morally questionable paths. He became a symbol of the anti-hero type that came to define modern Westerns. People respected him not just for his acting but for the way he seemed to really become his characters with quiet authenticity that came from personal hardship and experience. In the 1980s, Van Cleef tried different kinds of roles in TV shows and action-adventure movies. He starred in the cult classic Escape from New York in 1981 as the strict police commissioner Hawk and got the main role in the NBC series The Master in 1984, where he played a retired ninja master. Even though these later projects had different levels of success, they showed his ability to change with new trends in the entertainment business. Lee Van Cleef's personal life was marked by several important relationships, each of which happened during different parts of his journey through Hollywood and beyond. His first marriage was to Patty Ruth Cale in 1943, a marriage that began during the crazy years of World War II. At that time, Van Cleef was still early in his acting career, having recently changed from his service in the United States Navy into the world of stage and film. Patty Ruth, who became his loyal companion during these important years, stayed with him as he began to make a name for himself in the business. Together, they started a family, having 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. The responsibilities of being a father and the demands of a growing acting career put a lot of pressure on Van Cleef, who often found himself torn between the hard work of movie sets and the needs of his young family. Even though they had shared history and spent years together, the couple eventually found their relationship stressed by the difficulties that can happen from life in the public eye. In 1958, after 15 years of marriage, Lee and Patty got divorced, ending his first and longest-lasting marriage. 2 years later, in 1960, Van Cleef got married again. this time to Joan Marjorie Drain. Joan came into his life when his acting career was going through changes. He had experienced both good times and bad times in Hollywood, and was still getting better from a serious car accident in the late 1950s that almost ended his future in movies. Joan gave him emotional support and companionship as he worked to get back on his feet in the business. This marriage lasted for 14 years, and covered an important time when Van Cleef experienced a major career comeback, especially in Europe, where he found international fame starring in famous spaghetti westerns like For a Few Dollars More and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Joan stayed by his side as he reached a level of stardom he had never known before, but like his first marriage, this relationship too would eventually end in divorce in 1974. The reasons behind their breakup stayed mostly private, but it's likely that the ongoing pressures of fame, frequent travel, and the intensity of life in the entertainment business played a part. In 1976, Lee Van Cleef got married for the third and final time, this time to Barbara Hablone. By this point, Van Cleef had firmly established himself as a global star, especially beloved in Europe for his commanding on-screen presence and unique features that made him a memorable and often scary figure in Western movies. Barbara became not only his wife, but also a constant and stabilizing presence during the later years of his life and career. She stayed with him during his final years of movie work and supported him through various health problems, including ongoing issues from his earlier car accident and lifelong smoking habit. Their marriage lasted until his death in 1989, making Barbara the widow of a man whose legacy continues to live on through his legendary performances, her loyalty, and devotion were clear in her continued efforts to honor his memory after his death, and she is often remembered fondly by fans as the woman who was there for Van Cleef when the final curtain fell on a remarkable life and career. Lee Van Cleef, the tough gunslinger with the unmistakable presence, earned his reputation as one of Hollywood's most unforgettable tough guys, while he worked with some of the greatest stars in movies. Not all of those collaborations were friendly. Known for his blunt nature and no-nonsense professionalism, Van Cleef didn't put up with fools or big egos easily. Behind the scenes, he reportedly clashed with several fellow actors because of personality conflicts, disagreements about acting, or pure hatred. Here are 6 actors Lee Van Cleef is said to have despised the most. Lee Van Cleef's relationship with John Wayne was complicated to say the least. On the surface, both were huge icons of the Western movie type, but underneath that movie common ground were deep differences in personality, politics, and professional respect. While Wayne represented the all-American, flag-waving studio-backed cowboy ideal, Van Cleef carved out his image through grittier, European-made spaghetti westerns that enjoyed moral confusion and movie realism. Van Cleef was a craftsman, a man who built his career from the bottom up, starting with unnamed roles and tiny parts as villains. He was angry about how Wayne, backed by powerful people like John Ford, dominated the Western movie type with a sense of entitlement. According to crew members on overlapping studio lots, Van Cleef found Wayne pompous and dismissive, especially when the Duke reportedly called European westerns cheap cowboy flicks. Van Cleef, whose fame exploded in Sergio Leone's For a Few Dollars More and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, saw that as a personal insult, though they never starred together. There were rumors that Van Cleef turned down a small role in a John Wayne film simply because he didn't want to be second place to a studio puppet. In private, he called Wayne Hollywood's mascot and avoided any interaction with him on red carpets or press tours. The rivalry, though never openly publicized, was well known among Western insiders. 2. Charles Bronson. The Battle of the Brooding Tough Guys. Charles Bronson and Lee Van Cleef were often considered made from similar material, rugged, quiet, and intense screen presences who could carry a film with a single angry look. But Van Cleef reportedly got annoyed at the constant comparisons and harbored an underlying hatred toward Bronson, especially in the 1970s, when both were at the height of their European fame. The breaking point may have come when Bronson got the lead role in Once Upon a Time in the West, a Sergio Leone epic that Van Cleef had expressed interest in. While Leone had previously favored Van Cleef, he chose Bronson instead for the lead. Van Cleef allegedly took this as a professional betrayal and questioned Leone's loyalty. In later interviews, Van Cleef subtly made fun of Bronson's wooden acting, and once joked that a block of granite could show more emotion. On set, when the two briefly crossed paths during overlapping productions in Spain, tension was said to be so thick that producers deliberately scheduled their shooting times differently, even though both actors were quiet professionals. Van Cleef considered Bronson's quick rise an example of Hollywood rewarding style over substance, which Van Cleef, trained in theater and method acting, found insulting. 3. Clint Eastwood. From student to enemy. Perhaps the most surprising person on this list is Clint Eastwood, the man who helped elevate Lee Van Cleef to international fame. Their work together in For a Few Dollars More and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly was legendary. But behind the scenes, their relationship was far more troubled than it appeared on screen. At first, Van Cleef admired Eastwood's .com attitude and ambition, but as Eastwood's fame exploded in the 1970s, Van Cleef felt thrown away. He believed Eastwood had used their collaborations as a stepping stone and then turned his back on the actors and directors who had helped him rise. Eastwood's change from actor to director made the gap even wider, especially when he didn't cast Van Cleef in later westerns like High Plains Drifter or Pale Rider, roles Van Cleef thought were perfect for him. Rumors suggest that Van Cleef even reached out to Eastwood's production company for potential collaborations in the early 1980s, but was politely ignored. In interviews, Van Cleef was diplomatic but firm. "Clint's gone Hollywood," he once said. "He's traded in dust and grit for cameras and cocktails." Though Eastwood never responded publicly, industry insiders confirmed the coldness between the two. Legends was real. For Telly Savalas, the eccentric showman versus the quiet gunslinger. Telly Savalas, best known for his role as Kojak, crossed paths with Van Cleef during the 1970s when both were frequent faces in European crime and action films. Savalas, with his flamboyant personality and ego-driven approach to fame, reportedly rubbed Van Cleef the wrong way. Van Cleef was a no-nonsense professional who valued discipline and subtlety, whereas Savalas enjoyed the spotlight, often dominating sets with his charisma and unpredictable behavior. During a brief overlapping production in Italy, allegedly on neighboring sets, Van Cleef was said to have walked off after hearing Savalas make fun of his acting style as stone-faced squinting. Their personalities were simply oil and water. Savalas was the loud cigar-chomping scene stealer, while Van Cleef embodied a quiet, controlled threat. Rumors continued that Van Cleef refused any future offers that would pair them together, citing creative incompatibility. His polite way of saying, "I can't stand that guy." 5. Yul Brynner, the ego with a cowboy hat. Yul Brynner, famous for The Magnificent Seven, was another person Van Cleef held in contempt. While both actors had roots in westerns, Van Cleef viewed Brynner as too theatrical and too concerned with his carefully created image. Their differences were about looks and philosophy. Brynner was smooth-mannered and often aloof, while Van Cleef was raw, grounded, and intense. Their paths crossed at several European film festivals and award shows, and though polite in public, Van Cleef reportedly found Brynner arrogant and dismissive. A famous behind-the-scenes story involves Brynner allegedly turning down a co-starring role with Van Cleef because he didn't want to share the screen with a second-string gunslinger. Van Cleef never forgave that comment and often mentioned Brynner as an example of Hollywood elitism. When asked in a European interview in 1985 about actors he respected, Van Cleef notably left out Brynner from a list that included Henry Fonda, Franco Nero, and even Charles Bronson. That omission spoke volumes. 6. James Coburn, a clash of cool. James Coburn, known for his smooth charisma and effortlessly cool attitude, may seem like an unlikely target of Van Cleef's anger. However, the friction reportedly came from Coburn's casual attitude toward acting and his tendency to overshadow others with laid-back charm. Van Cleef, who had to fight tooth and nail for recognition in Hollywood, felt that Coburn had strolled into stardom, coasting on charm rather than craft. A particularly sour incident allegedly happened when both actors were considered for the same lead role in a European Western. The part went to Coburn, prompting Van Cleef to accuse the producers of choosing swagger over substance. The bitterness grew when Van Cleef heard Coburn joke in an interview that Lee always looks like someone stole his horse, although the comment was likely meant as a joke. Van Cleef, always the serious, prideful craftsman, took it as an insult. While they were never openly hostile in public, Van Cleef reportedly warned younger actors, "Don't model yourself after Coburn unless you want to sleepwalk through your career." Though Lee Van Cleef was a complete professional on set, his strong sense of artistic integrity and hatred for arrogance, favoritism, and studio politics led him to hold grudges against some of the biggest names in Hollywood. Whether it was belief differences with John Wayne, personal betrayal from Clint Eastwood, or personality clashes with Savalas and Brynner, Van Cleef's list of Hollywood enemies reflects not pettiness, but a deep commitment to the craft and a refusal to play the fame game. In the dusty corners of movie history, these rivalries add yet another layer to the mystique of the man who was above all the bad, and proudly so. Despite suffering from heart disease from the 1970s and having a pacemaker put in during the 1980s, Van Cleef continued to work in films until his death on December 16, 1989. He collapsed from a heart attack in his home in Oxnard, California. Throat cancer was listed as a secondary cause of